In short, isn't the conspiracy theory mindset a kind of critical thinking? Okay, so a man goes to a psychiatrist complaining that he feels himself to be a kernel of corn. After a few sessions, the psychiatrist persuades the man that he's not a kernel of corn, he's in fact a human being. It all seems to go well until the next day when the man returns, terrified of the chicken outside. The psychiatrist says, "Look, we've been through this. You're not a kernel of corn, you're a human being." "I know that, you idiot," says the man. "But does the chicken know?" There are a lot of ways of interpreting this clever little joke, often told by Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher. But the way I'd like to focus on it is that the man, in the madness of his delusion, was able to think deeper about his problem than his psychiatrist was. So I've been reading the comments section of some of my recent videos where I've been reacting to 1-star reviews of classic literature. And one of the chief complaints that I've seen in the comments is that people who find the classics boring just need to think deeper. And while I understand that sentiment, I can't 100% get behind it because I think modern readers often dive into the classics without knowing the historical context or being familiar with the language and idioms, and from that perspective, the classics can often seem quite boring. But I do agree with the idea that we need to think deeper. One of the comments that really struck me claimed that critical thinking is dead. So here's my response to that question. Is critical thinking dead? The short answer for me is no, it's not dead, but I do think it needs reviving in all of us. When I was about 5 years old, I remember jumping for the light switch, which I couldn't quite reach, and my dad, observing this, handed me a badminton racket, which I put on the floor, stood on, and still couldn't reach the light switch. Of course he was laughing at me, but in fairness, the badminton racket was too thin. Okay, let's get a definition of critical thinking. What do we really mean by this expression, and what's the problem here? Well, the roots go very deep, right back to ancient Athens, where Socrates asked a lot of questions that annoyed a lot of people. He challenged assumptions. He exposed contradictions. And he claimed that the unexamined life is not worth living. From this perspective, critical thinking isn't about being cynical or dismissive. It's really about asking why we believe what we do. Aristotle emphasized that an educated mind should be able to entertain thoughts and perspectives without accepting them. Later in the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant defined the Enlightenment itself as man's emergence from its self-imposed immaturity. For Kant, thinking critically meant having the courage to use one's own reason, sapere aude, dare to know. For him, critical thinking was an act of intellectual independence. But the modern sense of critical thinking, I think, owes a lot to the Frankfurt School and their critical theory. Thinkers like Adorno and Horkheimer warned that mass culture was turning thought into consumption. The critical theory of the Frankfurt School was an attempt to answer one central question. After centuries of abuse by the dominating forces in society that the Frankfurt School termed the hegemony, why was Russia the only country to rise up and revolt in 1917? Their suspicion was that modern industrial culture, dominated by capitalism, kept the majority of us subdued, preoccupied, and anesthetized, too distracted by commercial consumption and entertainment to rouse our faculties and think critically for ourselves. The Frankfurt School examined the subtle ways that society kept people in their place. By using things like consumerism, entertainment, and debt to prevent us from mobilizing our abilities to think critically about why things are the way they are. They feared that industrial capitalism and later mass media would train us not to think, but to react. And that distinction between thinking and reacting feels more urgent now than ever. But here's a question. It's commonly said that the mood of the critical thinker is skepticism. Then how can we say that there's a famine of critical thinking when there's lots of skepticism around us? People are skeptical of science, skeptical of the shape of the earth, skeptical of vaccines, or the reality of the moon landings. In short, isn't the conspiracy theory mindset a kind of critical thinking? So here I'm going to argue there are two faces of skepticism. There's a kind of skepticism that sharpens the mind, and another that clouds it. The interesting thing is that both come from the same impulse, the sense that the world is not always as it seems, and that truth demands questioning. But from that shared beginning, two pathways unfold. The first path, we'll call critical thinking, treats doubt as a tool. It's the kind of skepticism described by Karl Popper, who said that science advances not by proving things true, but by proving them false. Critical thinkers doubt in order to learn, to expose their assumptions to the light and see what remains standing. Bertrand Russell once said that the mark of intelligence is the ability to entertain an idea without fully accepting it. That is the spirit of true skepticism, to be open enough to consider, but disciplined enough to test. It's really an attitude of humility before the complexity of reality. Okay, the second path looks very similar, and it begins with doubt too. But it uses doubt in a different way. Rather than using it as a tool, it uses it as a destination. It's a kind of blanket suspicion that assumes that everyone is lying, that everything's a cover-up and nothing can be really known. Where the first form of skepticism asks, how can I know? The second form declares, no one can know. And anyone who says they can is in on the act. This is the logic of conspiracy thinking. It feels like critical thought, but it inverts it. It questions authority, but never questions itself. It is, I think, in this way, a corruption of skepticism. A loss of faith, not just in institutions, but in the very possibility of truth itself. Real critical thinking, by contrast, keeps a kind of double vision. Both the ability to doubt and to believe, to balance curiosity with caution. It asks for evidence, but it also recognizes sometimes the limitations of evidence and the necessity sometimes of trust. Karl Popper warned that if we abandoned the idea that truth can be approached through reason, we open the door to dogma and fanaticism. And Russell, ever the optimist of the intellect, believed that a sane society depends on the cultivation of modesty, patience, and a willingness to say, I might be wrong. The difference between genuine skepticism and its cynical counterfeit is the difference between thinking as an act of care and thinking as an act of fear. One expands our understanding and the other narrows it until nothing remains credible. So critical thinking isn't about doubting everything, it's about doubting well. It's about finding that delicate but crucial middle ground where we can question without despairing, where we can seek truth without pretending to own it. Okay, so now that we have some kind of definition or grip on the idea of critical thinking and the nuances that are involved, what are the challenges that oppose it in our society? Well, we live today in what Neil Postman called an amusing ourselves to death culture, where information has become entertainment and attention itself is a scarce resource. Algorithms reward immediacy, outrage, and simplicity, not nuance and complexity. The philosopher Byung-Hul Chan calls this the burnout society. He says that we've replaced contemplation with constant activity, endless scrolling, liking, and sharing. These are all forms of micro-reaction that give us the feeling of engagement without the substance of full understanding. When we live in a world where everything is designed to be consumed in seconds, the act of thinking critically, which takes time and patience and even a willingness to be uncomfortable, starts to feel quite alien. And here I think it's important to say that discomfort is an important part of critical thinking, a willingness to sit in that middle ground, not completely knowing and not having all of our questions answered immediately. Discomfort is often a precursor to growth, and sometimes we have to sit not knowing for some time. I know from the many comments under my videos on Wuthering Heights that Heathcliff makes us uncomfortable as a character. He's a bully and he seems to exist beyond morality and law, but he's also not a simple villain that we are supposed to hate. We're given enough of his internal workings and logic to kind of understand where he's coming from, although we would completely disagree with his actions, which are awful. This causes us to challenge some of our own assumptions about morality and how we feel about so-called bad people. I think the same effect can also come from a close reading of Frankenstein, where the narrative encourages us to see things from the perspective of the monster. That's an uncomfortable experience. By rushing to a quick rejection of the work or a quick assumption about the work in the hopes of avoiding that kind of discomfort, I think we run the risk of missing the opportunity to really think deeply. Which brings me back to those one-star reviews of the classics that I reviewed in some of my videos. When someone says that Wuthering Heights is boring or that Frankenstein doesn't make any sense, they're not just expressing taste, they're revealing something about how they've been trained to read. Classic literature isn't designed to entertain us instantly. If anything, it's designed to unsettle us slowly. To think with a text like Wuthering Heights, Frankenstein, Paradise Lost, or the Iliad requires patience, curiosity, and humility, the very muscles of critical thinking. Which is why I think reading a classic piece of literature is kind of a small act of resistance against the culture of speed and immediacy that we live in. It forces you to dwell in ambiguity, and to live with characters that you don't fully understand and probably don't like, which throws us into the position where we are forced to see from perspectives that we don't agree with. This all approaches, I think, what the Romantic poet Keats called negative capability, the capacity to exist in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Which is why I think classical literature is a great teacher of critical thinking, because every time you encounter a text that refuses to give you easy answers, you're practicing the art of thinking for yourself. These books don't tell us what to think, they demand that we do the thinking. Years ago, as an undergraduate at university, a great tutor and became a great friend of mine, the playwright Dick Edwards, told me of his view of the difference between cinema and theatre. He said, in cinema, a director grabs you by the scruff of your neck and tells you, look at this and look at this, with lots of close-ups where you are directed in what to look at. But when you watch a play on a stage, you are free to look at what you wish. You're not being directed in the same way as when you watch a movie. When you watch a stage play, your perspective is less controlled. You're free to glance at whatever you wish, and the act of making the choice of what to focus your attention on is a key aspect of critical thinking. Another great tutor of mine at university, Dr. Harrison Solo, when I graduated with my doctorate, bought me a copy of this book, The Intellectual Life. So, a century ago, the French Dominican philosopher Antonin Sertillanges wrote this book, which quietly became one of the great manuals for deep thinking. In it, he talks about 4 different types of reading. And his chief point here really is that reading should act in service to thinking. Let me explain what he means by that, because what he has to say about reading changed how I read books forever. So the first type of reading is what he calls material reading, where we're gathering facts, data, and references to collect raw material that we will later shape with thought. Sertillanges says that this type of reading is necessary but dangerous because it can become endless. He warns, never read when you can reflect, and never read when you can be creating. For him, the point of reading isn't to drown in information, It's to feed your thinking. And if you find yourself reading without stopping to think, then you're grazing. And grazing is fine if your goal is just to relax with a good book and escape for a few moments. But in terms of expanding your critical thinking, it's entirely possible to graze thoughtlessly. His next type of reading is slower and more deliberate. He calls it formative reading. This is the kind of reading that we do to digest an idea. This is when we pause, we underline, and we question the text. You make the ideas in the text your own, and you digest them. Sautillange says, a book is a living voice. It speaks to you when you put questions to it. This kind of reading can transform you and turn your mind from a mirror to a lens. Next, there's assimilative reading, which shapes not just what we know, but who we are. He counsels us to choose the best authors who nourish and elevate the soul. When you spend time with great writers, Shakespeare, Plato, Austen, Woolf, Montaigne, you're letting their voice refine your taste and judgment. You're learning not just to think about the world, but to think within it more beautifully. This is the kind of reading that builds intellectual and moral DNA. If you're familiar with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the creature finds a small hovel to hide away in, and he finds some books, and he begins to read from Goethe and Milton. And I believe this is the kind of formative reading that he does, attempting to form his own mind and his own logic and his own intellect. Finally, the greatest form of reading, according to Sautillange, is creative reading, the kind of reading that gives birth to new ideas. It's the kind of reading that you become so absorbed in the book that you begin to think with it rather than about it. He says, when you read in this way, ideas that are not in the book arise in your mind, and you should seize them. And his counsel to us is that whenever an idea strikes us as we read, we should stop reading, because that's when the real work of thinking begins. Every book is a doorway to creative thinking and critical thinking if we allow our imaginations to be ignited as we read. Okay, so in our exploration of critical thinking, there's another problem that we need to encounter. In the digital age, context has become very fragile. We're so often exposed to snippets of information. A line from Shakespeare, a quote from Nietzsche, a meme about Kafka, all of which are detached from their original world and given to us as repackaged content. The danger here isn't that people misquote, although they do quite often. The greater danger is that they do not feel the weight of context. And critical thinking thrives on context. Critical thinking demands that we ask, where does this idea come from? What assumptions shape it? What prevailing ideas is it subverting? When you remove all of those questions and all of that context, what's left is just opinion, loud, fast, and very self-assured. And then we can mistake having a view for having a thought. Now, if you're a little bit older like me, you'll remember the days before the internet. I was educated at secondary school before the internet, and the internet promised a revolution of information. The only problem with this is that education of the past used to be about forming minds that could think critically and analyze. Whereas I think the emphasis now is much more on filling minds with relevant information. The old liberal arts ideal wasn't just about reading books, it was about cultivating judgment. And today, of necessity, education is increasingly vocational. It's focused on employability and outcomes and skills. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when everything must be justified in economic terms, then subjects like philosophy and history and literature start to feel like a kind of luxury. And with them goes the slow, difficult practice of thinking through complexity. Martha Nussbaum claims that democracy itself depends on the humanities because they teach empathy, imagination, and critical reflection. Without those, citizens become consumers and politics becomes marketing. So when we ask the question, is critical thinking dead? We might really actually be asking the question, whether the conditions that make critical thinking possible are disappearing. This means that it's down to us to reflect on the type of content that can form our minds. When people ask me in the comment sections of my videos whether reading the kinds of classic literature that I promote is worthwhile, I say yes, and rereading them through life is crucial because they are challenging and they are prone to shape and provoke our thinking. Okay, but here's the hopeful part. Critical thinking isn't a talent that some are born with and others aren't. It's simply a practice or a skill that can be revived. Every time we read something deeply, discuss it openly, or question an assumption, we're reviving critical thinking. Even your comments under my videos, when thoughtful and challenging, are part of that process. The internet isn't only a place of distraction, it can also be a space of dialogue. The problem isn't the technology itself, it's the habits that we bring to it. So perhaps critical thinking isn't dead, it's just been in exile. And maybe it's our job as readers and thinkers and human beings to bring it home again. When people call the classics boring, I don't think they're wrong, not entirely. Because to someone who is raised in the culture of scrolling and swiping, slow reading really can be boring. But that boredom and that slight discomfort might be the doorway into something really important. We may not get that quick fix, but we can then dig deeper. If we can learn to stay in that discomfort and sometimes that boredom and resist the rush to judgment, I think critical thinking will see a revival. I believe that critical thinking is there waiting for us to slow down, think, ponder, listen, and start again. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Thank you to the people who have been supporting this channel thus far, the members, those who have bought me a cup of coffee. Your contributions make these videos possible. If you've enjoyed this, please think about subscribing. Let me know in the comments what you think about critical thinking. What will become of us in this culture of fast-paced media? Thanks for watching.